back, little helpers. Today we are going to talk about something that affects all of us, but in varying degrees. It affects us at work, in relationships, and especially may affect us if we have loved ones who are suffering from mental health disorders. The topic is stress. And today we have helping us Dr. Matt Scult, who is a licensed clinical psychologist in private practice in New York, a digital mental health consultant, and the VP of clinical science at Scenario. So, Matt, thank you for coming to talk to us about all things stress.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Before we get into the important stuff, just want to also say that Matt is probably responsible for most of my career because we went to grad school together at Duke, and then he pulled me into the internship program at Cornell, and then I basically credit you also for pulling me into digital mental health as well. So you are Matt is my what is it, mentor behind the scenes.
Well, I just love working with Kibby, so I'm just trying to figure out every way to keep figuring out ways that we can work together and chat about mutual interests.
I'm down for it.
Matt was so influential in your life. I also spoke with Matt before. I don't even know if I was already in Duke or if you were just some...
I think you were applying.
I was applying?
Yeah. You were thinking about it.
Remember how we got connected. But yeah, we had a conversation on the phone about application best practices or something, or maybe it was interview tips. Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is Matt has been marionetting us behind the scenes for a long time.
Thanks, Matt. I hope it's been helpful. Yeah, just excited to help however I can.
So, Matt, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how this topic became so prominent for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, let's see. In college, I was studying neuroscience and was just fascinated by how the brain works and how the interaction between what's going on in our brains and our bodies and how that's connected to everything that makes us human, how we're feeling, how we're thinking, how we're acting. And so after college, I started working at a mind-body medicine institute at Mass General Hospital, the Benson Henry Institute. And there was studying the physiological effects of stress and interventions to target stress. And in particular was looking at meditation-based interventions that were trying to kind of have the opposite effects of some of the physiological effects of stress. And it was fascinating. I mean, I saw, we were doing studies showing that things that you're doing, like meditating over the course of 8 weeks, can have effects on your physiology in the way of affecting your which genes are turned on and off. And having that profound an impact, over that short a time frame. And it wasn't, that's what we were studying, but it's not unique to meditation. It's really that by learning, by experience, what we're doing really has an impact on our bodies and vice versa. What we're doing, with our bodies is affecting how we're feeling and thinking and behaving. And so I think that kind of really kicked it off for me. Stress was always a factor, even if it wasn't the primary thing. I studied in grad school at Duke, as you mentioned, and was studying the neuroscience of kind of risk and resilience for developing different disorders. And of course, we were always looking at how stress was coming into play and a factor there. And then after grad school went kind of more on the intervention side. So I started I finished on my training at Weill Cornell Medicine and then was studying kind of digital interventions for targeting anxiety for young adults, and really was fascinated by the different ways that we might be able to use these digital tools to expand access to care. And so I, after that, started working at some companies that were looking at this and saying, okay, how can we really get these tools out to people in a way that's going to help as many people as possible. And so I started working at Modern Health and was overseeing our clinical strategy for our in-app content and our groups there. Did that for a couple of years, and then started consulting. In the background was doing the private practice piece as well. And then started working about a year ago at the company called Scenario. At that time was called Loop. And looking at how we can use digital tools there to help improve kind of a variety of different everyday challenges that we're having. The original focus was on social anxiety and then loneliness, but we soon realized that kind of the approaches we were using were much broader than that and could help with a variety of different challenges and really things that are bringing up stress in our lives, and thinking about like how do we flexibly adapt and approach these situations so that we can decrease some of the negative effects of the stressors that are having on our day-to-day life.
That's cool. That's really cool. What is stress? I mean, I mean, that's such a stupid question, but
no, it's a great question.
Because it's, when I just hear stress now, I think, well, that's just like a catch-all word for like bad feelings. Like, who isn't stressed, right? Like who would say that they're not stressed? But I almost think like that it's so vague that I'm not even sure what it is, aside for like a more vague term for anxiety or depression or just general ickiness. So yeah, no, and you're definitely not alone there. I think the term is just used in so many different contexts that it kind of does start to lose meaning. I think the definition that I think is the best is stress is when kind of something happens in our lives that feels beyond our ability to cope with it. And, it's especially true when there's situations that are unexpected or can't be controlled. And so, that is really broad. And then the other part of stress is there's the stress, there's a stressor, there's the thing that causes stress, there's this, and then there's the stress response. And that's kind of your body marshaling resources to deal with the situation. So you're probably, familiar with like your heart beating faster to get more blood to your muscles and your brain. You're breathing more quickly to get more oxygen. Your muscles are tensing up to prepare you to, run away or fight. And so that's all stress. And like you said, stress gets this kind of negative connotation, but stress isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like it's this natural response, and there are many situations where stress is good and can actually be helpful and adaptive. And so I think that's a really important thing that, happy to talk more about, of like how we kind of think about when stress is helpful, when it's not, how the ways we think about stress might actually impact whether it's going to be helpful or unhelpful. And so I think those are all like really important things to kind of tease apart there.
I'm like very invested in this topic because I have a partner who is chronically stressed, and I would love to know how to help him or how he can help himself. And so I guess the first thing is, this idea that there's good stress or bad stress, or maybe that stress could just be conceptualized differently. How is there like a tipping point for stress when it becomes bad, or is it more about attitude? Like how do we know if stress is good or bad?
Yeah, so I think kind of it's this complex interplay, and part of it is how you're viewing it. So part of it is the intensity and the chronicity. So like, are you under really extreme stress? Are you experiencing some really kind of traumatic, on the high end, some traumatic event that is happening? And so, that might be, the level of stress is going to have, not necessarily completely determine the impact, but is going to have a big effect there. Then there's how kind of chronic it is. Is it something that's happening one time? Is it happening kind of all the time? Like low levels of kind of chronic ongoing stress can be really difficult as well. And then it's like, is the stress something that, that we're able to kind of like recover from? So I think an analogy that I find helpful is like, let's say you are going to go for a run, right? So if you're like, all right, I'm going to start right now and I'm just going to run and not stop. Like if you just did that for like days on end,
like
that's not gonna
great. That'll be stressful.
Yeah, it'd be stressful. Your body wouldn't last that long. Like it's not something that's really sustainable, right? And would kind of probably all agree that running forever isn't something that's really going to work out that well. On the other hand, like exercise is one of the best research things that's actually like improves our physical and mental health, right? Like, so when you go and you're, get physically active, on a regular schedule multiple times a week, but then you have time to recover from the stress of the exercise, then, exercise actually has some parallels to like the physiological effects of stress, interestingly. But when you're kind of pushing your body in that way and then you can recover, it actually is really good for your body. It's used to that challenge. And then, let's say then you do have to go for a long run, you're being chased by a bear or something, then like you're ready to do it, right? Your body's ready to go. You're like, I've been running every day. I hope none of our listeners, run into a bear that's trying to chase them down. But it's like, I think like that's preparing your body then and for that type of situation. And so like the actual like active of the exercise more regularly isn't necessarily a bad thing. And I think for stress, we can think about it the same way. Like if you're constantly stressed, then it's going to take a toll on your body. But if you have like, that there are a bunch of things that really push you and are beyond your comfort zone and ability to cope, but then you do cope with them and then you have time to recover, like that's actually something that's going to be helpful in the long run, and can be really useful.
So it's really, it's more the up and down. It's like it's the stress and then being able to recover.
Yeah.
Versus like stress all the time. That's really the key that makes it helpful and not harmful.
That's one of the keys. Yeah. I wouldn't say necessarily it's the only one, but I think that's definitely one of the factors is like, do you have the ability to recover from it?
Recover to what degree? Like recover to the point where you are no longer stressed at all? Or like if you have chronic stress at work, is like every weekend getting some downtime, is that enough? Or does it depend on how you conceive of the stress? I'm trying to calculate when exactly Jason will die. So I'm just trying to...
There's a handy calculator there for the...
Right, or if you like switch between stresses, right? Like if you, on the weekend there's a different kind of stress than the work day. Does that count?
Yeah, I think like different. I mean, the short-term stress response is actually like a very short time scale. So we're talking on the order of like something that's happening over, a couple minutes. And so like when we think, so that's like, but when those then add up, right? So if you have like that 100 times a day, then that's going to be different. And so like I think the different types of stressors matter for our kind of flexibility and ability to cope with them. But yeah, I think some of it is also like how often is this you're having this stress response. And I think like the way you're viewing it does come into play, right? So do you see it? There's actually some great research by Aaliyah Crum, who's at Stanford, on like stress mindset is the research. And she found that people who like see stress, and there's some interesting interventions where they kind of like help people train this way of thinking, is that like if you see stress as all bad and all negative, it ends up kind of being a self-fulfilling prophecy that it actually is worse for you than if you're able to see it as like, well, stress actually sometimes can be helpful and adaptive and help me to grow. And so if you're then see that, you are able to benefit more from these moments of like when you're being pushed and challenged versus, and you don't have some of the negative effects of the long-term stress. Like, I don't know if she's looked at dying sooner necessarily as the outcome, but I think they've been shorter term scales of the studies. But yeah, like some of the other negative effects in terms of like, just how you're like the oxygenation of the and the oxidation. I mean of how much nitrous oxide you have in your blood and things like that, which are kind of like the short term, some of those short term negative effects, things like that.
Okay, well then, so if the stress mindset is that you should see stress as good sometimes, but you know me, I'm like always stressed, but how do you know when it's like too much, right? Like there's some people like me who just seem to chronically get themselves into like a stressful situation or constantly, like putting them, like overloading themselves. How do you know if you're like, oh, all stress is good, but then you're overloading yourself? How do you know when to cap that or to like limit that?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple different answers to that. One is like, as you probably talked about, and oh yeah, I remember in some of the previous episodes, you're talking about like noticing, like getting in tune with, your like something you do in CBT, right? Like looking at what are different triggers, what are the different thoughts that happen, behaviors that happen, physiological responses. So kind of noticing how your body is responding in different situations and saying like, okay, after a day of doing this, am I completely exhausted and have nothing kind of left? And am I completely depleted? Am I more irritable? Am I like looking at how you're responding can be some of those clues of like, okay, maybe these are really, things that are pushing me beyond kind of the limits of what's making me to function really well. You can also see like when you're in that like medium like stress zone, which is really kind of the ideal, you often like feel energized, right? You often like are really able to focus better and perform really well. And then when it starts getting to be too much, it's actually harder to focus and harder to perform well. And you kind of notice that maybe things are getting pushed a little too far. So, I think like being able to tune into this either on your own or having someone, either a friend or professional, kind of helping you to notice some of these of your own like warning signs and like when things are kind of getting to be too much can be helpful to say like, all right, it seems like the impacts of stress are clearly affecting me. And so how can I do some things to help myself recover a little bit more? What are some things that are going to be rejuvenating, more relaxing, to bring down some of the stress level and counteract some of that?
It seems to me there's a difference between two kinds of stresses I'll bring up, but I wonder if there's an actual physiological difference between the two. So one is somebody who is stressed because of objective life circumstances that are stressful. So like somebody who can't feed their family and they're just like constantly having to, figure out how to make money. It's just go, go, go. And then there's a kind of stress where it's more about perspective. So like I've noticed in getting a PhD, I'm a fairly like lower stress person. And I think one of the reasons is because I'm able to say basically like it's going to work out and this isn't the be all end all for me. So like there were some milestones that I would approach really differently than my colleagues who, one of them I think like developed like a diagnosis around the MAP, or so around the thesis paper. And so that's less about objective circumstances and more about the way you think about the stressful circumstance. Like passing this MAP is so important. What if I fail? And then who will I be? Where will I go? Everything is catastrophic. Does that get processed the same exact way in the brain and body, or is there a difference?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think I think that is a really important distinction to make. I think like in terms of how it's processed, it depends a little bit what exactly you're getting at there. Like if you're worried about putting food on the table, right, then the worry is going to have a lot of the same physiological effects as if you're worrying about failing your MAP or dissertation, right? And so like that worry, if you don't have enough food, that's a different type that's going to like impact your body in a different way. And that, also is a way of kind of like taxing the body, having a stressful impact. So like if if your body's if you're malnourished, like that's definitely going to have like a impact in a different way.
I guess maybe even a better example might be like a resident who has to work 80 hours a week and they don't really have a choice about it. So it's just like this very objective stress versus like
is there objective stress though? I mean, to Matt's point, it's like one is the examples you're bringing is like this pure survival, right? Like you're blocked from like certain like basic needs of like food or something like that. Whereas like, I'm just wondering how much is objective versus subjective because,
right?
I mean, like there might be residents who are like, "This is amazing. This is like my life's calling."
Well,
and someone else might be like, "This is too
and
much."
That's where I think these interact and like why, I'm excited to talk about some of the like ways we can target the mindsets, but also the environments and both kind of pieces of that because I think like you said, we can't. In many situations, it's really hard to disentangle the two, right? Like if we Like we're rarely completely, you know, isolated, meditating in, you know, the mountains by ourselves and like not interacting with the world. And also on the flip side, like if we're not interpreting anything that's happening, like it's hard to kind of even conceptualize what that would be like if we didn't have any interpretation of like what was going on. And so, you know, again, there are those like basic, like if those basic needs aren't being met, that's going to have these physiological impacts as well. But I think outside of that, it is, I mean, you're bringing up like some of these are maybe more controllable than others. And that's one of the key things of like often how stressful people find things. And so if things are perceived as uncontrollable, that's often more stressful or unpredictable. But it is that perception. Like even like one of the best measures that is used in the stress literature is this perceived stress scale, or at least one of the most commonly used measures. I don't know if I'd say the best, but it's the perceived stress scale. You know, it's like how do you perceive the stress? And like that is just like so baked into all of our models of stress, is like you have to kind of interpret things, and that there is a level of like subjectivity to that. But it's also not devoid from what's going on in our lives. And so we need to kind of like think about both of like, how are we thinking about things, and how are we targeting the sources of our stress and trying to decrease, you know, minimize them, get them in a state that we're able to better handle them. Things like that.
What are different sources of stress? Just because like we're talking about controllable and uncontrollable, and we're talking about work and relationship, I'm curious if there's like, I mean, I think when people think about stress, at least when I do, it's like the obvious stuff, right? Deadlines or like a fight with someone. Are there like secret sources of stresses that or like where are there some that are like worse than others? Or
interesting. Well,
what stresses us out?
Yeah. Let's talk about all of our individual stressors. I know that there's like, you know, the American Psychological Association does a survey every year of like the top kind of sources of stress, and for them, like in the last one they put out, I was just looking this over, like actually adult education, like college, you know, that grad school, that MAP, Jacqueline, that you mentioned, you know, is definitely up there. A lot of people who are in education as adults are reporting that as a big source of stress. Health, both like physical health problems, mental health, is what people are reporting as like sources of stress. Work for people who are employed, and money, as we were talking about, and then like relationships are big as well. So like, you know, whether it's intimate relationships, family relationships, friend relationships. So those are some of like the top things that people often are reporting. And, you know, and then there's like the societal level things as well, like social division and things like that are highly rated. And so there's like the kind of getting back to Jacqueline's point, for a lot of these, there are the objective and the subjective. So like there's one of the questions delve deeper into like money, right, as the cause of stress. But one of the things was like money is a cause of a lot of fights or tension in my family is what one of the things people are reporting. So it's both the fact that like if people don't have enough money to feed their family, that is stressful, and that like you need food. And there's the like added layer of stress there of like how that leads to family tension and fights and arguments, and like how, you know, the interpersonal kind of relationship piece that's layered on top of that is also an added source of stress.
That's interesting. How do you deal with stress? Because as you mentioned, grad school and the thesis, the MAP paper that we had, I just had a memory of like you being in the midst of writing that paper, and we were in this like really tough class and stuff like that. I remember you said at some point that was like probably the more stressful times in grad school, but I remember you as always like even keeled. Like it's so funny that we're talking about stress with you, because you do like really hard stuff and don't seem stressed at all. You're always smiling. You're always like, you know, engaged and like curious. I've never seen you go, fuck this. Like I'm tapped out. I've never seen you do that. Yeah. So how do you deal with it?
So I do. I mean, I do get stressed. I think like but I think like some of the things you mentioned are things that I find helpful. Like you mentioned, like kind of being curious, and I think like that for the mindset, like that's kind of overarching, one of the things I see is like that our mindsets have a big role, and that's like the kind of that Aaliyah Crum literature, and it's backed up with like other literature. There's like single session interventions, and those like, you know, target all different things, but like in particular, a lot of the approaches are like, how do we kind of help people to have like a more open mindset about things and be like curious? So like bringing some openness and curiosity, kind of being able to like, from the cognitive restructuring literature, see things in different ways and try and like say like, all right, what's a different way to view this situation, can be really helpful, and just something that like I often is like a go-to for me, just like does happen, you know, somewhat naturally, and then I've tried to develop it more. So I try and be like, how can I like have fun with this, learn something new, like, you know, see kind of like the flip sides of like, okay, these are the parts that are hard about it, and these are the parts that like are really cool about what I'm doing, and like, you know, where I'm thinking about learning and growing. So I think those all have been helpful. And then I have found meditation, like I started meditating in college, and not always the best about doing it regularly, but kind of having a meditation practice and mindfulness is helpful. When I exercise, it's helpful, although I'm pretty bad about getting in a regular exercise routine. So, but when I do it, I find that also helpful.
Well, that part's interesting too. I mean, first of all, I just find meditation so stressful. And so it was kind of talking about the mechanism there. But again, with the objective and subjective, like one of the reasons I think Jason is so stressed is because there's a lack of sleep and his job is very physical. So he's exerting his body so much. And yet exercise is often prescribed as like a, you know, something helpful for stress. Does that depend on where the stress is coming from? Like, is exercise only helpful if most of the stress is kind of coming from your head? When is mindfulness maybe more appropriate? How is mindfulness good for stress when a lot of people's experiences of deep frustration?
Yeah. I mean, I think like what in terms of like what's kind of is exercise different for different types of stress? I don't think I have like necessarily an immediate like good answer for that. I think like it does, you know, different people are drawn to it, and like the different, like with everything, like there are a lot of nuances, and so it depends like what type of exercise, how much. If he's already doing a lot of things that are really physical, maybe his body's already taxed in that way, and so that's, you know, there are other things that would help be more helpful, or like there's little added value at that point potentially of additional exercise. With sleep, you know, if like sleep impacts how we're feeling. So if he's having trouble with sleep, like I think like, you know, I've worked with people in doing cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, and like those treatments can be, you know, challenging to go through, but can make a real difference for people. But like how that comes into play for me, again, this doesn't work for everyone, but like with mindfulness, if I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm thinking about stuff, my practice of doing meditation or mindfulness helps me to let that go, to let the threads, like my mind's racing about something, or I'm worried about something. I'm like, oh, all right, this is the middle of the night worried thought. That's one thing that like helps me to like get a little distance from it. And then I'm like, all right, I'm like, if this is a real concern, I can kind of think about it more in the morning when I'm in a, you know, better headspace to kind of think about this. And then with the mindfulness also, like I've practiced like bringing my attention back over and over and over again. And so I like, you know, I do that in the middle of the night if I'm up, and I'm like, all right, I'm going to like bring my attention, like I'm going to let go. My mind's latching onto this thought again, and it maybe does it like 50 times, but I keep like letting it go, and coming back. And I'm like, all right, maybe like when I'm tired, I'll fall asleep. But right now I'm not falling asleep. So I guess like, you know, my mind's too kind of wound up. The practice has helped me to then put less pressure on that for myself of like, I need to fall asleep right now. And so like, those are all things that like kind of like ways those come into play for me in those situations. Again, like everyone's different, everyone has different needs. And like, so, no, you know, it might not work at all, or different variations might be more helpful for him. But those are kind of like, in my situation, what those look like or how they come into play.
Do you really meditate regularly? Do you have a regular practice?
I mean, like, you know, I'll go through periods where like I won't do it at all for like a month or two, and then I'll be doing it, you know, like 4 or 5 days a week for like, 10 or 15 minutes a day. Like that's kind of like my practice. And then, but yeah, I find it helpful. But, one of the things that I kind of like, I think it's a great technique. Like I find it really helpful, but as like you both were saying, or at least Jacqueline was saying, like you were saying that like, you don't like it as a technique, right? Or it just.
Well, I honestly, I like mindfulness a lot. Meditation I find really frustrating. So everything you were talking about, like noticing your thoughts and being able to kind of label them and say like, this is not something I need to focus on right now. I can let that go. Or releasing judgments about myself. So basically getting a little bit more meta and being able to look at the content in my brain and sort of decide what to focus on and notice what's pulling me in or not. I find that very helpful. But when I have to go through like a 10-minute meditation, I just the mind wandering and then bringing it back over and over again tends to frustrate me.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't feel relaxing. So I've always thought of it as like, mindfulness doesn't need to be relaxing, but over time it's really helpful in kind of getting the geography of your brain under control and being able to, I can see how it would reduce stress in the long term because it allows you to not focus on the thoughts that might be increasing your perception of stress, for instance. Like it could help cut through some rumination. I just, for whatever reason, find that like when I have to do that as a practice, I can almost do it more like as I'm walking through my day and I notice thoughts coming in, just being like, yeah, I don't need to focus on that. But when I have to sit down and like think about what's happening in my body and like, get in a comfortable position with my eyes closed, it immediately kind of makes me more stressed out.
Yeah, because I think like, and I mean, I think that is a common experience for me, like the practice, like it's a way of just practicing so that I can better have the mindfulness in the day to day for me. And so like, but yeah, I think for some people that when you aren't doing the other things at the same time, it's just like, there's too much, right? And it's not, and like, it's easier to do a walking meditation or, or doing a mindfulness exercise of like, noticing, tuning into the sensations of, while you're typing or eating or whatever it is, and like doing other mindfulness exercises that aren't the like meditation, like kind of a seated meditation time for me. Yeah. For me, it just like is a practice that helps, like literally practicing like the way I would practice tennis to then be better at playing when I'm playing a game. And so like I see the meditation as just like the practice time. But like the other thing I think is like that it's not, like and this is kind of like coming back to the digital mental health piece. It's like I saw that like in what's available to people mostly right now is meditation, right? They're like very popular meditation apps. And so if you want like some mental health tools, like most things people are going to do is they're going to go to Headspace or Calm and start like doing one of those meditations. But there's so many, different tools that we have, right? Like as clinicians, that people are just like it's hard to have access to if you're not in therapy. And so I think like that's one of the things that drew me to kind of digital mental health, and like the work at Scenario was like thinking like, how do we get some of these other tools to people? Like if people don't like meditation, right? Or if they've been doing it and it does work for them, but like, then you just have like only one tool, right? And so how do we like get these other tools to people? And so that's where like, working on something like Scenario, which is like, you're able to then use these ways to personalize techniques and teach them to people, and people to practice and learn other techniques that could be really helpful for them. That's what gets me kind of excited about like where we're at right now, about like how we can, help people with other tools.
Yeah. Tell us more about taking a bath, which I don't like to do, like I think of I just get annoyed at the, almost like the overused strategies of just relaxing, which, if you're in a really stressful time, you got deadlines, you're in a fight with someone, like, doing something like taking a bath doesn't really fix it, right? So like what do we know? What tools are ways to help are you talking about? Or
and I think that's stress? Like really the key, that like that it's really been popularized, the people that like if you're stressed, you need to do things like take a bubble bath, right? But as you said, that's not getting
Yes,
at
self-care.
like any of the sources of stress. And so like what actually does is like figuring out like often there are things that right we're avoiding is like and so like a lot of the sources of stress are things that are difficult in some way or uncomfortable. And so it could be like difficult conversations. It could be like, you know, starting on that to-do list when you really don't want to, right? And it's like, this isn't a fun task and it's like something that like isn't enjoyable. It's like how do you navigate like conflict at work, or like how do you like support a loved one who's really struggling with things? And like those are like a lot of things that are causing stress. And right now, like most of the tools out there like have nothing to do with actually addressing these things, right? And so like that's where you know, these types of tools that I'm working on, like at Scenario, we're trying to target like how do you actually you know, approach some of the things that are the sources of stress in an effective way. So what we do is like you come into the app and it says like what's the situation you're dealing with, and so you just like write it out. Like let's say I'm getting in arguments with a partner, okay, like, and that's like a big source of stress. Or or my partner is really stressed. Like let's use the, you know, Jacqueline, the example you were saying, like my partner is really stressed, has a difficult like time, like has a stressful work life, isn't sleeping well, and I just feel kind of like helpless, like I don't know what to do to support them. And then we ask like, what is your goal in the situation? You know, and thinking through like drawing from evidence-based practices like DBT does this, like various CBTs, of like thinking through like, all right, what is my real goal here? Like sometimes like even that in and of itself can be a real intervention. It's like, am I trying to like get a certain result? You know, am I trying to like make sure that I get like something that I want? Am I trying to like show up for the other person? And like, is the relationship like really the most important thing that I'm focused on? Is it my own like self-respect, or like kind of like having my own like emotional needs or what I need to put at the forefront? And like, what if those are in conflict? Like, what if I can't have it all? Like, of course, like whenever I think about this or go through this, I'm like, yeah, well, I want all those things, right, all the time. But like, what if you can't have all of them all the time? Like, even going through the exercise of like articulating them and prioritizing, like, well, right now, I'm actually showing up for my partner is the most important thing. Like, even though I know I'm right about this argument, you know, that like, I don't need to make that point because that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that I want to show that like I'm there for you, you know? And so like, I think that can be like like subtle but important like step of an like micro intervention or like a piece of an intervention, right? So like, what's your goal? And then like, having insight into what's getting in the way, like what are the kind of the blockers that are showing up, like why is this something that's challenging? It's like, oh, we kind of like fall into the same patterns or arguments, or we're just like stuck, I don't know what the next step is, or what, like, so even figuring that out and like having some guided questions to get there can be really helpful. And like knowing if you don't know what the problem is, it's really hard to know where to start. And then thinking about like what's an effective approach, and that's where like I've, you know, here like in Scenario's example, like curated a list of like all these different evidence-based approaches, starting with like interpersonal things, like things to, you know, navigate conflict with other people, be like supporting others, but then also like even like if it's just something that you're, you know, ruminating about or struggling with, like what are some evidence-based approaches you can draw from? Because that like often people, yeah, like I said, there's just only a few of those that are often in the literature. So like being able to like have those as a like examples and what they mean and explain them in a like just in the moment when you really need it, yeah, it can be a really helpful way to go. And then what we do is we put those into a what we're calling a visualization. Visualization means different things to different people, but it's really drawing from like some of the even like the skills training literature, the psychoeducation, but also like the exposure like literature. And so here it walks you through a situation. Like, let's say I'm going to have that conversation now with my partner about like, all right, you know, I've noticed that you come back from work and you're really stressed, and then like we get in an argument and then you don't, you know, sleep well and things like that. And like but I don't know where to start. Like I've been avoiding this conversation. So then walking through like almost like a narrative scene that you can read or listen to, helps like bring up some of the like the emotions that are going to likely come up in that situation, so that if it's something I've been avoiding because I'm like, I don't want to like get in this argument, I don't want to feel uncomfortable, I don't want to like feel upset, by kind of going through it ahead of time, it helps to like bring down some of the emotions so that when you do it in real life, you feel better prepared. It's less overwhelming. So it's both like illustrating like how some ideas, it's not like telling you how to do it, but it's like some ideas for how you could do this in like a potentially effective way. Trying to get some of that flexibility that I mentioned before of like, all right, I hadn't quite thought about like maybe if I try this approach or like think about it this way, things could go a little differently than they did, when we get in the same argument. And then like now I feel kind of better prepared because instead of just like going in hot, like I'm ready to like have this like kind of, I've already worked through it myself. And so I'm ready to kind of like focus on my goal, which is showing up for my partner, and so that's like one example of like how we're using these tools in a way to kind of like personalize these types like of examples and situations.
I'm having some murky thoughts that I'm going to try to pull apart. So I love the idea that it's like we're actually going to get to the bottom of your stressor and try to solve it so that the root of your stress is not there anymore. That feels a little bit like an approach to, it feels a lot like an approach to anxiety. And so I guess my thoughts are murky because, Kibby brought up the bath situation. I feel like a lot of people opt for relaxation techniques because of the physical component that stress can take on. And I mean, maybe there's a conflation between physical stress and emotional stress. I know when I think of chronic stress, when there's not necessarily anything to solve. So for instance, my patients who are going through fertility treatments, where it's just like, we are infertile, there's nothing I can do except for go to these appointments. I can see why relaxation tends to be the advice, because it's like, what can you confront right now? Other than to just relax your body, which might be like a little bit might be strained from the effects of your stress. So I guess what is the place of relaxation? And maybe what tools might you use if the stress isn't something solvable or something you can necessarily confront, but just something you're living through?
Yeah, really good question. I think there are a couple different components. So I do think there's a place for relaxation. I think more the issue is that it's overused than it like shouldn't be used. And I think like relaxation is helpful. It helps like bring down, it can help bring down the stress. But it like you said, it doesn't solve the problem. And often people are using relaxation in situations that like problem solving or like identifying, like targeting the problem would be more helpful. When you can't.
I also have patients who are very resistant to it.
Right.
Like,
people say they don't have time for
that.
it. For some people, it makes them feel like, notice their bodies, which they don't usually, and are like trying to bring it down, have these expectations that it's going to happen immediately. And then when you don't, it feels more stressful. So there are all different reasons where relaxation might not be the go-to. I think, but it is a tool that I think, is useful in some situations. I think acceptance is another one that's really hard, but it is like an important piece that like is, the mindfulness can help with some acceptance sometimes, but like I think more explicitly kind of working through like, how do I come to terms with this and accept like whether it's a particular outcome or the unknown of the outcome, and like how do I come to kind of like make sense of this for myself, and in a way that like I am able to accept the reality of like what is happening right now, rather than kind of like fighting against the reality of it. I think acceptance is a hard concept because a lot of people think it means that you're okay with what's happening, when it's not, right? So I think like these can help get at that by kind of like illustrating examples of like how you might, like we can also do like self-talk in the app. And so like if you're talking to kind of like your inner thoughts in a way of like, how can you do that in a kind of accepting way? And then there, I think a lot of times there is then this like there are those interpersonal pieces later on top. So like if you're going through the infertility treatment, like does it add to like kind of difficulties in your relationship? Does it help go through like, with the partner, with like friends and family in different ways? And so like if those are also then contributing to the stressors, like thinking through like, all right, how do I have those conversations is another kind of like way you can target some of the sources. It's not the original source, but it's like the secondary sources of stress.
Can you give me an example of how most people use scenario?
Yeah, so people use it. I mean, it's cool. There's a variety of different use cases. Like the people are using it for job stress. There are a lot of relationship stresses. So people are in relationships, or like people who are in new relationships. Like, so there are a lot of people who are saying like, all right, how do I, I'm going on a first date and nervous about it. Like, I want to prepare for this. How do I kind of go through? And you can practice like, some people are like, I'm terrible at making small talk, right? Which, it's judgmental kind of self-phrasing, but like it's, that's how people are viewing it. And so it's like, it makes them really uncomfortable. And so how do they kind of practice being with that discomfort of like making small talk, both like generating some ideas of like, oh yeah, here's like different things I could talk about I wasn't even thinking about, and like, what if there is like a moment of silence, like in the conversation? How do I cope with that, right? So, like,
So stressful.
Yeah, exactly. Did you feel the stress? So, like, how do I? And so, like, going through that and being able to like tolerate that, which I don't know if you two have had this experience. Like, a lot of, therapists I know, whether or not they were really comfortable with silence beforehand, become more comfortable like throughout their training and working as clinicians, and like, whereas a lot of non-clinicians might not be. And so I think like you can practice. That's something that like you can kind of train and get more comfortable with the discomfort. And so those are all different types of situations. But sometimes people are also like, how do I like there's something about my own mental health or the mental health of a friend who like, I don't know how to have this conversation with them, right, about it. Like, there's something that I've noticed that they're not taking care of themselves. How do I have this conversation? I've had, I'm concerned about my teenager who's like, seems really anxious after, I think there's like some connection between kind of what's going on. Like maybe even the parent doesn't know, but like what's going on with like, there's, their interactions with social media and like what they're feeling their kid's stressed about. They have a friend or partner who's like depressed and they don't know how to like talk to them about it. And so these can be all things that like people can practice like doing. And so like I think I didn't mention before, but Scenario like uses AI to help like personalize things. But I think a lot of uses that I've seen that are not ideal is like AI is like, here, we'll tell you what to say. And I think like that's not going to be helpful for people in the long run. And so here it's more about, it might help give you some ideas, but it's more about the practice of like going through a realistic, not, it's not going to be what actually happens, verbatim, of course, but like a realistic type of situation so that then you can be, when you're actually in it, it feels less of this like unknown thing that just like you're trying to do for the first time in when it's happening, and instead you can be like, all right, now I like feel better prepared for it, because it's just like so many things like we prepare for that are not our social lives and our emotions, and it's like we prepare for all these like professional, academic, like all these things, but like it just it makes sense that it would also be helpful to prepare for our social and emotional lives as well.
Well, I was just wanting to know about I know I'm stuck on the physical, but like, are there physical effects of stress, and is this reversible? Like if we, using Scenario, like how much wear and tear is there on the body? And if you get treatment for something like this, can it be reversed, or are you just halting a process? Do you know anything about that side of things?
Yeah. So, I mean, like before when you said, I don't know if you're joking, but there is, there are animal studies and there are, I think some specific study isn't coming to mind, but I think some like in the human literature about like stress and like lifespan, right, and mortality rates. And so I think like they're, certainly, and like telomere length and things like that. So there are like, physical impacts of stress that can have things on our health and like our longevity. But the good news is like coming back to actually some of the work I was talking about when I was at Mass General is like there are things we can do that even over the short term have an impact. And like when we go like, yeah, if you start meditating, exercising, trying like different, techniques that they can actually have an impact over the course of like several months. And, some of even the effects, kind of very different literature, but like smoking, like if you, stop smoking after a few years, like you drastically increase your chances of living longer again. And so like the good news is like, everything we do impacts us and we can't remove experiences. Like once we've had them, experiences have an impact on us, but going forward, like the experiences that we're having, there's a lot we can do to have like really positive impacts. And so that, certainly is true of the stress literature, that when we do things that are going to have like be adaptive and healthy and for our physical and mental health, that's going to be able to have those downstream effects on in terms of our physical health as well.
My last question is how can loved ones help, right? If we see, I mean, this is too applying to your situation, Jacqueline, but like if you have a loved one who's stressed all the time, and I know it's a common thing to be like, don't stress, you should relax, you should chill out, but that doesn't seem to help. What can loved ones actually do to help a loved one with their stress?
Yeah. And I think, so, I think the example you just gave is like a situation that might come off as invalidating, right? And so like, how can someone instead be kind of validating in their response? And so like, that's something that can be really helpful and something that, could be practiced in a situation like through something like Scenario. But I think like everything else, it's not always one size fits all. I mean, I've seen kind of the opposite end of the spectrum where sometimes people are trying to be really validating and empathic, but it ends up kind of like, kind of enabling in an unhelpful way, right? Mm-hmm. And so like, I think like that's where these personalized interventions, whether it's like talking with a therapist or coach who can help you, or, getting some ideas from some of these app-based interventions, can help you to think through like, all right, what's something that might be most helpful for this person in this situation? Like, is it actually figuring out a way to, like kind of to step back a little bit and not put as much pressure on them? Or is it helpful to kind of help push them a little bit and say like, this person's not getting out of bed, like saying like, that's okay, why don't you just stay in bed all day if they're really depressed, isn't going to be helpful. And so like, how do you kind of think through, different ways that you can really help to be that effective support person. And I think there are different, that being able to have these different tools and different ways of doing so is really important.
It reminds me of Caitlin Fang's dissertation about burnout, where it was like half the group, one of the groups did like deep breathing or something, like some relaxation thing, and the other half just did their project. And the group that did their project is the one who had less burnout. So it just reminds you that like a lot of the time it might feel like the work is what's burning you out, when it actually might be maybe like avoidance or anxiety around the work or perceptions around the work. Is Scenario, like, is it available to everyone right now? How would somebody sign up?
Yeah, it's in the App Store. I think if you search Scenario, and maybe I can give you a link to put in, or Get Scenario. The website is getscenario.ai. And right now, just like all of us, a work in progress. And so like, I think like how we think about, would love kind of things that you love about it, things that you don't, things that aren't working, so we can think about how to improve it as we're continue working on it.
Cool. I'm going to get it and test it out and see if Jason would actually use it and maybe benefit from it.
I'm excited to hear. Yeah, definitely keep me posted.
My crusade to lengthen his telomeres.
Yeah, there you go. I know, we've measured some outcomes in terms of confidence, that it's like some of our initial ones is that it helps boost people, like people report increases in confidence in approaching these situations from using it. And so like, I think a third of people said that they, or there was a 33% increase in confidence levels from before to after.
Man, now this makes me want to go down a new road, because I will say, like, I think confidence might be the major difference between when I'm stressed and when I'm not stressed. If I have confidence that I can do it, that the outcome will be good, then I just have the normal stress of like having to use my brain for several hours in a row. But I feel like so much of the time when I'm stressed, it's because I'm doubting myself. I'm getting really, really frustrated because I'm like, I can't do this. I can't do this. And that just skyrockets stress. So I would think that raising confidence would be a huge win.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think like I couldn't agree more. Like I think that comes back to like at the beginning we were saying like the, you know, thinking about stress is like when it's beyond my ability of like something that I can handle. And like, so if we're increasing, like if you were like, oh, actually like, it's the same situation, but now I'm like more confident that I can handle it, then that completely shifts it. That makes a total difference. So we still need to look at kind of like specific stress outcomes for, you know, for this app, but I think like confidence for situations is hugely important in terms of like how people kind of, you know, the stress impacts of it.
All right. Well, Matt, thank you so much for coming to talk to us about stress. I know I'm going to try out Scenario. And I don't know if do you want us to provide a link to our listeners?
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll send them on.
Okay, cool. And little helpers, if you want to lengthen our telomeres, please give us a rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We would love to hear your feedback. All right. We'll see you all in a couple weeks. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.